Hey Lorcana fans. So we're coming off set championship weekends. I don't know about you, but I got to play in a couple events. I had a great time. I hope you did too. I happened to win a 54-person tournament with an Emerald Amethyst deck, and I am really excited to talk about the deck, why I love it, why I love Emerald Amethyst, how it plays, and to tell you why I think it's one of the best decks in the format right now. So Amethyst Emerald has been around for a while as a competitive ink pair. Well, sort of. It was really popular in set 1. I think it was a very good deck. I loved it. And then it kind of disappeared from the meta in set 2 for a variety of reasons I can talk about later. But now it's back in set 3, and I think it's kind of better than ever. The fun thing about this color combo is there's a number of different ways that you can adapt the deck or build it depending on your local meta or your playstyle. There's a discard package, there's an evasive package, and then there's the one that I kind of like, which is kind of a mid-range bounce package. And all of them share, a lot of cards, but the way you change it up and the way you change up your end game specifically really changes what matchups you're good against and bad against and how you play the late game. Now, most of these builds are kind of mid-range tempo builds. There is an aggro build you can do, which floods the boards with early aggressive creatures, and it's one of those you win fast or you lose fast decks. I'm not going to talk so much about that one, but let's talk about the mid-range decks. Mid-range means that you kind of occupy the space between control and aggro, or aggressive decks, which means when you're playing an aggressive deck, you want to play kind of as a control deck, and when you're playing a control deck, you want to play more as an aggressive deck and be more aggro. And I'm going to talk about first few turns and kind of how you play both of these roles in a minute, but before I do, I want to talk about the control matchup, because there's something really important with this mid-range deck I think you need to consider, and that is you have to think about the game as occurring in two separate phases. And that's because against most of the control decks in the meta nowadays, they're going to gain control of the board eventually. Most of their removal is in the high end, so eventually they're going to get to an ink total that'll allow them to clear the board, to gain control, and you're gonna have a hard time keeping a lot of things out there. And you have to expect it and you have to prepare for it. And how you prepare for it is to build your lore total early. So the first phases of the game is all about aggression. It's about dropping high lore characters on the board and getting as much lore as you can before your opponent gains control of the board, which will happen eventually. And once you move into phase 2, it's all about trying to get that last 6 or 7 lore, and you do that a couple of different ways, one of which is questing one time with characters that you put on the board, perhaps trying to save them with a bounce and a replay so they're ready again. It's also using the goat or goat bounce to try to close out the game, and then perhaps you throw in a high lore character for your end game. For example, I run Kuzco's, and I'll talk more about that later. But it's really important to think about the game as occurring in those two phases, I think. Aggression early, and then later on just kind of scrappy, trying to get that last little bit of lore. And that's against most control matchups, I think. Now, there's nothing super special in this build that other people aren't playing, except I'd argue perhaps Kuzco's. I have thrown those back in. I love them at set 1, and I think they're good again during the second phase of control games, which I'll talk about later. The other thing that I started working in recently is Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, which is a fantastic card that can get you a lot of lore quickly and allow you to do some shenanigans. Mother Knows Best, I think, is an important card because it does give you some bounce, but it also allows you to affect your opponent's board and bounce something back to their hand if you need to, which can be a lifesaver in some scenarios. Other than that, I think it's a fairly standard list. It has worked in some castles, and overall, I just like it a lot, yeah. So let's talk about the first 3 turns. It's tough to say what exactly the ideal opening hand is because, like most mid-range and tempo decks, it's situational. It depends on if you're playing a control deck or an aggro deck and what specific flavor of control deck you're playing. But this is a hand that I would be excited to have against a deck I didn't know what it was, or against control decks. Against an aggro deck, I would look for a couple different cards, maybe a befuddle or a kit in my opening hand. But this is a great opening hand because with this deck, as I said, one thing you're trying to do is to be aggressive pretty early and to start to drive your lore totals. And it also, with the early Merfolk and Flynn, allows you to put your opponent in a tough position, having them decide whether or not they want to discard a card in order to ruin your early aggro. So with a hand like this, I'd be pretty excited. So let's talk about turn 1. Most of the time with this opening hand, I'm playing Merfolk on turn 1 for 2 reasons. One is, against most decks, I want to drive my lore total early. Also, Merfolk is uninkable, so playing it early allows me to get that uninkable out of my hand, and otherwise I'm going to have to sit and wait to play it later, and it reduces some of my flexibility, and maybe I'll have to ink something that I don't want to ink. So Merfolk is generally the turn 1 play you're going to go for, but having Rafiki in your opening hand does give you some flexibility if you end up running into a hyper aggro deck or perhaps a Steel Song deck, and you want to put some early pressure on a 1-2 Cinderella if your opponent plays that in the first turn. But in general, let's assume here that I'm going to go, I'm going to play the Merfolk. Here, I could ink the castle, I could ink Rafiki. In this instance, I'm going to choose to ink Rafiki, and I'm going to play the Merfolk on turn 1. Let's assume I'm on the play here. All right, turn 2, I'm going to draw. Looks like I'm going to draw into another Flynn. And on this turn, Flynn is probably my play. Again, I'm looking to drive the lure totals early. Now, we do have Ursula Deceiver Deceiver as an option here. One thing I want to note with Ursula Deceiver is you don't always want to play her on curve. Against some decks you might, against green or emerald steel discard decks, in some instances I might want to play her early. If I'm on the draw and my opponent's 1 ink ahead of me, and on turn 2 they're going to go into turn 3 where they have Let the Storm Rage On available, or other removal cards like that, perhaps I will want to play her on curve to protect my Merfolk, depending on what they have. But in general, especially against control decks, I'm saving her until the right moment. Perhaps I'm saving her till my opponent plays an Ursula Deceiver of All and I know they're setting up a song, or I think they have another 3-cost character on board and they're going to sing Friends. Or against a Ruby deck, I might wait till turn 6 or turn 5 with a ramp deck until I play Ursula Deceiver to pick that Be Prepared at just the right moment. The other thing I'm looking for is the right moment to play this when I think my opponent's about to Whole New World. So if I think they're going to shift into a Champion of Sherwood, perhaps a 5-cost card that can sing a Whole New World on the turn that it's shifted, perhaps I'll play Ursula Deceiver there. But the big note here is that Flynn Rider is my turn 2 play probably 75% of the time here, and Ursula Deceiver I'm going to save, especially since in this scenario I have 2 of them. So let's say here I'm going to I'm going to ink one of my Flynns, and I'm going to play Flynn here. And that's my turn 2 play, and here I'm questing for 2. Now, of course, my opponent here can choose to challenge my Merfolk and remove them, but that puts them in a position to discard a card, and I'm kind of happy forcing them into that position and driving the tempo here myself. Okay, so let's look at turn 3. I'm setting up my lure totals nicely. Turn 3, I draw minions. It's not a bad 1-cost card to have early game on Exert here. So this is my state going into turn 3. Now here, I mean, the obvious choice is to set up the Deceiver of All package and to go from here. I have another option, which is to play the minions and Ursula Deceiver, and that's an option as well. The play here, obviously, 90% of the time is Ursula Deceiver of All. The only exception is if I'm playing against an Emerald deck. An Emerald deck where I think they might pick my friends. Because to be frank, if I'm playing against Emerald, most of the time I've inked friends on the other side already. I'm so worried about Deceiver taking that friends that if I am playing an Emerald deck, I'm going to abandon this combo early. I'm probably going to ink Ursula Deceiver, or I'm going to ink friends on the other side first, and then I will probably ink Deceiver of All after that. Because she is not a great card on her own, and I don't like playing her and hoping that I draw into a song card that I need. So anyway, if this combo is still available, if I'm playing a control deck, then my play here is probably, I'm going to save the Deceiver to use later if I'm playing a control deck, let's say Ruby Amethyst or Ruby Sapphire for my 3 ink here, and I'm going to play Deceiver of All for my turn 3 play. And here, I'm questing for 6, assuming my Cursed Merfolk is still on the board. I'm sorry, questing for 4, assuming my Cursed Merfolk is still on the board to bring me to 6, and that's my play this turn. Now here I'm clearly setting up the Friends package, which is really nice. And going into turn 4, let's see what happens here. I draw again. I've drawn a Madam M Snake, which is a fine card. And going into turn 4. Turn 4, obviously the first play is to sing Friends on the other side with Deceiver of All. And this really sets you up for the rest of the game. Like this is the primary purpose Ursula Deceiver of All is in this deck, is to sing Friends, to draw 4 cards. Because if you can hit it on turn 4, if you hit this combo, which happens surprisingly often, it sets you up for the rest of the game. I can't even get all these cards on the board. I have the goat here. So this is what this looks like now. And here again, I'm set up to quest with a lot of lore, and I have a decision on turn 4. What I'm probably doing here, what am I going to ink here? I mean, I'm going to save the, odds are Ursula's going to be removed, but I'm going to save the friends just in case. Here, I might ink, depending on what my opponent's playing, I might ink the Kit if I'm playing against control. Let's do that. Let's assume I'm playing against a control deck here, and Kit's not going to do me a ton of good, unless I'm bouncing a Minnie Mouse Surfer or whatever. And here, depending on the board state, I've a ton of different options available. The Goat, I'm probably not playing early. I'm probably saving. But the Castle is a great play here if my opponent doesn't have a huge board state, or if I don't think they have a Maui to remove it. I could also just play a Maleficent to expand my board state, draw a card. But another option here, if I want to drive lore totals, let's say I think that my opponent is really going to remove these next turn. Let's say they've set up, they're going to remove these. I'm going to quest with these this turn. I may bounce the Merfolk with a snake, and then play the Merfolk again. Or Flynn Rider, depending on which ones I want to save. In fact, Flynn Rider is probably the better play here, because if I want to save one of these two, Flynn has the higher stat line, so he's probably the one that I want to save. The other option here, obviously, is play the snake, bounce the Merfolk back to my hand, because it only costs 1. And then I could play Deceiver on this turn here. We are going into turn 5 when a lot of different songs open up for people. If I'm playing a ramp deck and they're going into turn 5, they'll probably have ramped into their Be Prepared at this point, and that's the last thing I want. So playing Deceiver here is also a great play. But in general, this is kind of what a really good opening for this deck looks like going into turns 1, 2, 3, 4. I've set up the Ursula Deceiver of All combo, which, you know, unless you're playing Emerald, is a really good opening. And I've driven my lore total here quite a bit. So I'm sitting on 6, 8, probably 10 lore at this point, and that's really sets you up for the second stage of the game. So let's take a look at this deck against an aggro deck. Now, you know, I've mentioned I really like playing this deck against control decks or other mid-range decks. It does do well against most aggro. Emerald Steel is a little bit of a rough matchup, but let's take a look at this against like a hyper aggro deck or Mufasa build perhaps. So against a hyper aggro deck, I'm a little less concerned about driving my lore total early, because you're not going to out aggro them. Even if you're on the play, you could out aggro them if you get the right draw, and I'll show you one of those in a minute. But in general, you're looking for more of the control draw, and this is the kind of opening that you'd been looking for. Some cards that's really key to have. One on for your 1-drop, you don't want the Merfolk. You want Rafiki or Chernobog's minions, something with a little more oomph that can get over a Simba or that can take out something early. Kit Cloud Kicker is your turn 3 play. You really want to get some tempo by bouncing one of your opponent's low-cost characters and getting another body on the board. And then Kit can sing next turn if you have something to sing. He's just fantastic. Ursula Deceiver is another card you may want against certain builds, but to be honest, she's not the best play. What she does pair well with, though, is Merlin Crab on turn 3. So if you happen into this combo, 3 willpower is great. It allows her to stick around after she challenges into something and forces your opponent to respond. So pairing Ursula with the Crab on turns 2 and 3 is another great combo you can look for in this opening. And then Befuddles are in this deck pretty much for the aggro matchup. So if you get a Befuddle early, it's a great card to have in your hand. You just have to use it at the exact right time, and you want to pick the right thing, perhaps one of the Mufasa decks or one of the hyper aggro decks early bodyguards to allow you to get through. So what does an opening look like here? So let's assume here that I'm on the draw and that my opponent is on the play with hyper aggro, which is not the scenario you want to be in. So let's draw for turn here. I draw into an Ursula Deceiver of All. And to be honest, she's probably one of the cards I'm inking next turn, but first turn here, the Castle is the first thing to go into the inkwell. It's a fantastic card, but against a hyper aggro deck, anytime you're not putting bodies on the board, it's rough. So that is the first thing that goes into the inkwell this game. And then here we are, Rafiki, which should allow me to challenge something early if they play, an early body, which they 100% will. All right, so turn 2, that's on the board. I draw, I get another Crab, which is not a terrible thing to have in hand. Not the best draw, but there are a lot worse things. So turn 2, I have a few options here. One, I am looking at what I can challenge with the Mystical Fighter. If my opponent opens something up, then I am challenging into it and trying to remove whatever I can early. If it's a 1 strength character, that's perfect. That's perfect, because here I can challenge with Rafiki, and I can use it to get my snake on the board if I'd like. So let's say I've challenged with Rafiki. Let's say Rafiki is still around, that they've opened up a Lilo or something to a challenge, and Rafiki is still there. In this instance, I'm probably inking Deceiver of All here, because the setup takes too much time. I might consider the Crab, but in this instance, Ursula Deceiver of All is going into the Inkwell. And in this case, I'm actually going to let Rafiki stick around here, and I'm actually going to play Deceiver, I think. The Snake is a play that I could play. It gets another body on the board. It bounces Rafiki though, and in this case, I'm really much more interested in removing as much as I can early, and trying to get through the hyper aggro rush. The biggest reason I'm playing Deceiver here is to take a look at my opponent's hand to see what I'm dealing with, and then the Crab makes her a great option for turn 3. So here we go. Let's assume my opponent has challenged him or has quested again. Maybe they're up to 4 or 6 lore. I'm going to draw another Snake. Not a great draw for me. The Snake is a great card, and it's fantastic for late game to pair with the Goat. But in this instance here, the Snake is not my best friend, because to play the Snake, it ruins my board presence and it sets me back a little bit, and I really want everything maximized on the board in this particular case. So this Snake is going into the Inkwell. Now note, I still have the Befuddle available if I need to remove something quick. I don't have an opponent's board state here to play off of, but in this case here, I have really 2 great plays. I could either A, play the Crab and buff Ursula Deceiver and use that to remove a 2-strength character, make Ursula a little more punchy. This is great for getting Ursula over a Simba bodyguard, or even a Prince bodyguard, the Steel bodyguard with resist, because it gives Ursula 4 strength. So fantastic play there. But I can also, if I don't want to play the Crab, play Cloud Kicker here, bounce one of my opponent's creatures, or characters rather, and then I have these 2 available here. So in this case, perhaps I've bounced the bodyguard, which they'll have to spend a whole other turn replaying, and then I've got a 3-strength character and 1-strength character here to do some removal. At this point, Rafiki probably is gone. Ursula's taken a bit of damage, and I'm doing okay. Next turn here, I in theory have removed a couple of my opponent's characters. I'm drawing. I get the Fox, which is a fantastic draw. It's a fantastic draw here, because here, especially if I can challenge with Kit and remove something, I can use the Fox to bounce Kit and get the ETB, the enter play effect again on a later turn. But here I'm going to have 4 ink available. Let's say I send this other Crab back. I do have another bounce card now, or I'm sorry, not other Crab, Snake. Let's say I send this other Snake back to the Inkwell. So here with my 3-cost characters, I have a few different options that I can pair with a Befuddle. So, I'm befuddling one of my opponent's characters, sending it back, and then perhaps I am challenging something with Kit. Ursula, if possible, 1 strength may not remove something. And then I can pay 3, bounce Kit, play the Fox, challenge with the Fox, and now I've got Kickbat in my hand, and I'm set up next turn, for a little bit of questing. So at this point, I should have some fairly good control of the board. I should have removed most of my opponent's things. They probably pushed their lore total a little bit, and now I'm starting to think about ramping into offense a little bit more. But I do want to start building a board state, and the Befuddle has helped a little bit, so hopefully it's put some pressure on my opponent there. And then going into turn 5, let's just play it out just for kicks. Ready, set, draw. I've drawn a Flynn. Not, the best draw into aggro, but again, this is the stage of the game where I'm starting to look at pushing my own lore, because I really have to start transitioning into offense a little bit. So we've kind of moved into a new phase of the game. And so in this case, inking something will give me 5 ink. So let's ink a Crab, and here I'll play the Flynn, and then I pick one of these 2 to play. It depends on if I want to buff Ursula or Deceiver with the Crab, or perhaps my opponent played the thing that I bounced with Kit before, and I bounce it back again. And now moving into next turn, I'm pretty well set up with some good board state. The one note here is, as you can see, it's easy to burn through your hand quickly. Luckily, I've got a lot of draw power in this deck, but hopefully I'm drawing into a rabbit next turn. I swear that wasn't staged. That literally was the next card. There's so much card drawn here. I do find that oftentimes you find what you need eventually, especially if you mulligan away the rabbits early, which you want to do in your opening hand. They're going to find their way up eventually. So there's a rabbit, and rabbit will draw me into Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, which actually, Bibbidi, well, I'll talk about Baby in a minute. And the next turn I'm drawing into a Maleficent. and then eventually the goat, which I can pair with the bibbidi, etc. So you can see that after the first few turns where you get your control of the board, now when you move into the second phase of the game, you're working towards the goats, you're working towards the rabbits, and you're starting to drive your lore total a little bit. And yeah, that's how that plays. All right, there's one more line of play I want to talk about, and that's maximum aggro. This is a line that comes up occasionally, and it really comes up when you draw multiple Flynns or multiple Cursed Merfolks in your opening hand or in your first couple turns. Now, this deck can do that, but it is a risk. And if this is a line of play you want to pursue, just know you're going to be kind of living on a knife's edge for a while. Let's assume that I'm on the play here. So turn 1, I have to find something to ink. I'm going maximum aggro, and I don't necessarily want to reduce my board presence to play a bounce card. So we're going to ink the snake early. I could ink a Flynn, but to give me more flexibility. But again, I'm playing maximum aggro, so I'm going to play the Cursed Merfolk. Next, I'm going to draw a card, and I'm going to draw Mother's Vest. Now, this is why I say that this is a bit risky, because as you can see, Cursed Merfolk is a couple uninkables in my hand, and the more uninkables I draw, the more I'm forced to ink, the limited options in my hand for cards that I don't necessarily need right away, and I have to play the Merfolk. So let's keep playing this out and see what happens. So here I have another choice. I can bounce something. I'm probably going to bounce the crab. Madam Mim gives me some more flexibility, gives me some aggro, and I can bounce something to protect a Merfolk later. So I'm actually going to ink the crab here because, again, I'm going maximum aggro. And here I'm going to play a Flynn Rider to get this 2-cost card out on the board. And here I'm questing for 2. Again, if I'm going maximum aggro, I'm probably against a control deck, maybe Ruby, Sapphire, so they may not have the queen to deal with this. And if they don't have the queen, or they don't have something, a hook or something to deal with this early, this line of play could pay off. So let's take a look at the next turn. Here we go. I ready. I draw a Kuzco. Now again, I want to highlight again that the problem I have with the inkables. So now I'm playing maximum aggro. My only play here, or my biggest play, if I'm going maximum aggro, is to ink the Madam Mim and to dump both the Flynn Rider and the Cursed Merfolk onto the board. I could go a different route, ink the Flynn, be a little more conservative, and then play and bounce, the Merfolk perhaps. But what the problem is, I'm going to have to play these Merfolk eventually anyway. So let's say I ink a Flynn and play the Madam Mim. I'm bouncing back probably the Merfolk because it's the cheapest option, and now I've got even more uninkables in my hand, and that's going to run me into a problem later on. So I think the strategy here is to try to win fast. And in this instance, I'm inking the Mim, and I'm playing out the Merfolk and the Flynn. And now I've got 8 lore on the board. So I'm in a position where, again, I can quest for 8 next turn. I'm questing for 6 this turn. Perhaps my opponent has an answer and let's say removes the Merfolk. Hypothetically. Now I'm questing for 6 next turn, and I've quested for 2, 4, 6, and hopefully I can get to 12 or 13 or win the game in another couple turns. So anyway, this aggressive line is a line that's available to you if you draw into the right hand, and sometimes you'll find yourself with 2, even 3 Merfolk thinking, is this the right way to go? And you can, against the right deck, go super aggressive early and close out the game fast. Just get a lot of lore on the board. But you have to understand you're putting yourself in a position where you could be on turns 4, 5, and 6 with only 3 or 4 ink, with not much available, and hoping that you draw into some draw cards like a rabbit or a friend from the other side. It's not the wrong play, but you have to get lucky with your draws on turn 4, 5, and 6 in order to give you cards that will recharge your hand and allow you to keep going. And you generally don't want to play this against a steel deck or something that can remove your characters pretty quickly. If you get hit with a few Let the Storm Rages On early to take out your early high lore characters, while your opponent's drawing cards to replace that card, you could be in a world of hurt. And then of course an early Grab Your Swords is difficult for you to deal with, and you'll lose the game pretty quickly. But this aggressive line of play is perfectly fine. It's great. You just have to use it at the right time. It's not always great, and you have to understand the position you're putting yourself in. So let's talk about the mulligan really quickly. I've kind of told you cards that you're looking for against aggro decks and then against control decks, but there's a couple cards you're always looking for, and then there's some cards that I'm always mulliganing away. I'm generally mulliganing away most things that are uninkable except for the Merfolk. Rabbits, I'm going to send them away. Oftentimes Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo or Mother Knows Best, I will often send those away. Goats, I know goats are such a critical part of the endgame. You're going to be looking for them later, but I generally don't want them in my opening hand. I'd rather play goats late game when I have Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, or I have Mother Knows Best, or I have Fox or something in my hand so I can bounce that goat back. I get much more impact from them later in the game. The last thing I want to do is turn them into ink. And again, if I'm playing against Emerald, I'm mulliganing away any song that I have because the odds of it getting picked on turn 2 are pretty high. So now let's talk a bit about the late game. Phase 2 of the game against control decks requires a lot of patience, and it requires living on the edge a little bit. As I mentioned, that you really need to think about this deck as a two-phased deck. During phase 1, so you're really trying to drive your lore total, especially against control decks. The higher you get, obviously, the more easy it makes phase 2. Eventually, odds are they're going to get control of the board, and you have to plan on that, and you have to accept it. It's fine. It's going to happen. And at that point, it's a bit of a race, but not a race in the traditional sense where each of you are getting lore every turn. They're trying to set up their end game, whether it's a dime or, a series of locations, or just, maintaining board control and dropping high lore characters on the board. So while they're doing that, you need to be dropping characters on the board. You need to be questing for a couple lore here and there. And more importantly, forcing your opponent to devote resources to responding to you. Once you get your lore to a point in the game where you're at 12 or 13 or 14, your opponent cannot ignore your characters on the board. They have to devote resources every single turn to dealing with your characters. So at the very least, those resources aren't getting them closer to their win condition. So what are you doing in this phase of the game? Well, you really have 3 ways, I think, like 3 main things you're trying to do to get lore to close out the game. The first is simply dropping individual characters that are going to quest and then be removed. So, there's really 2 flavors of that. One is, something like the Merfolk. It's a great card to get early game. It's not a bad card to get late game when you're in phase 2. If they don't have a ton of removal at their disposal, they may be able to target it with something, but dropping this on the board kind of forces your opponent to deal with it, or next turn you're going to quest for 2 lore, and that gets you 2 closer to victory. Are they going to remove it? Absolutely. The worst thing against a Cursed Merfolk, obviously, is a steel deck where they're playing a bunch of removal options. They can get rid of it easily. Against a control deck where they have to use a Maui, or they have to devote a Lady Tremaine, or perhaps a Madame Medusa or something to it, it kind of feels good for them to devote that resource to this character. They're spending their whole turn with 5, 6, 7 ink, to deal with this one character, and that's fine. If that's what happens, but ideally you play it, you get to quest with it, and it is probably removed. And I'll talk about something with this in a minute. The second option is Kuzco. Now, there's plenty of top end you can run in this deck, and I'll talk about all of that later. But Kuzco is a card. This is a French Kuzco, actually. Oddly enough, Kuzco is a card that I think is back. I loved running this in set 1. It's a fantastic card to get you 3 lore. There's really 3 ways to deal with Kuzco. One is to grab your swords if your opponent has them. The second thing is a Lady Tremaine, which you can play around a little bit. That'll force you to banish your own character if that's the only one on the board. And the third thing is a Be Prepared. And again, those are 2 things that you can kind of anticipate and play around. So Kuzco is a fantastic option. When you play him, most of the time, probably 85 to 90% of the time, he's going to get you 3 lore. So if you imagine the scenario when, let's say you're at 13 or 14 lore, you play a Kuzco, you get 3 lore out of him, now you're 2 or 3 lore away from winning, and that's exactly where you're going to be late game. So Kuzco is a fantastic option later. Spending a whole turn playing him is great, and I love him. And he's just good. But again, just play around those options, the Be Prepared and the Lady Tremaines, which are easy removal options. And the last thing is the Goat combo. Now, Goat can do all sorts of shenanigans. Here's one thing I want to mention with Goat. Goat is key to winning with this deck, but you're generally not keeping him in your opening hand. Early game, he's no good for you. You want to send him away. You want to put him back in your deck. You want to be drawing this card on turn 7, 8, 9, maybe even turn 5 or 6, but you want to draw one of these in the mid to late game. That's your goal. It's not to have him in your opening hand. So once you have the Goat, you are looking to maximize the value of the Goat. Yes, playing him on board is great. If you play him, he's there and he gets removed. You've gotten 2 lore out of him. That's good. But now you're in a position where you're looking for another goat. So ideally, you've drawn into at some point a Madam Mim, you've dropped into a Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, maybe a Mother Knows Best. You have some way to send him back to your hand, because ideally that's what you want to do. Now, if you have 7 ink, to be honest, I would rather drop him and bounce him in the same turn and have him next turn than leave him out to be removed. So if you have 7 ink at this point in the game, which you kind of should be building towards, 7 is exactly where you want to be, because 7 allows you to do a couple key things on the same turn. But if you have 7 ink, you play him, you bounce him, and that's exactly where I want to be. You could leave him out to quest, but it's a risk. You can also use Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. This card is just, you can do all sorts of shenanigans with this card. I'm running 2 and 2 Mother Knows Best. The downside is you can't affect your opponent's board state with this card, but it allows you to do all sorts of shenanigans, which I'll talk more about later. But in this instance, if you have 7 ink, you play the goat, you play Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, the goat comes back to your hand, and then you play the goat again. And in one turn, you've gotten 3 lore, and the goat sitting on board is representing a 4th lore, because he's either questing next turn or your opponent removes him and gives you that 4th lore. So this Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo Merlin goat combo is something you're working towards for the end game. If you get a Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo early, if you need to use it on a rabbit for some other shenanigans, card draw, you can, but ideally you're saving it for the goat. So really that's it. You are, every turn, you're trying to drop a character or 2 characters for your opponent to deal with. It might be a Cursed Merfolk, it might be a Chernobog's Minions, it could be anything. But you're trying to put that on the board, you're playing rabbit, you're drawing cards, maybe you bouncing the rabbit, drawing more cards, all in with the aim of drawing into a Kuzco that you can drop for 3 lore, or goat shenanigans. And that's how you're going to close out the game. So there's a few key cards that I want to talk about. The first one is Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, or BBB for short. This card allows you to do some interesting shenanigans in this deck, and I want to mention a few. The first is obviously the goat combo that we talked about earlier, where you can play him, you bounce him back to your hand, he plays again, and that's 3 lore in one turn, and that's just fantastic. That's really the big combo that this card is in the deck for. Without the goat Bibbidi combo, I don't know that I would run this card. But in the absence of the goat, there's also several other cards which are worth targeting with this, or choosing with this. The first is the rabbit. In a pinch, if you need card draw, bibbidying the rabbit allows you to do a similar Merlin goat shenanigans. You play the rabbit, you draw a card, you bibbity the rabbit, and you draw 2 cards. It's essentially like having a friend. And the best part is, Merlin can sing bibbity on himself. So if you don't have a friend to the other side, you're looking for cards, you play Merlin Rabbit. Next turn, you can sing bibbity, bounce the rabbit, draw 2 cards, and then Merlin's back on the board, unexerted, waiting to quest next turn, and it's just fun stuff. The other thing you can do if you really feel like it is you can bibbity Merlin goat rabbit switch shenanigans, because they both cost 4. You can have the goat on board, bibbity for the rabbit, or bibbity the rabbit for the goat. If that's a line that you can pursue if you really want to. The last thing I'll mention with bibbity is that the nice thing about sending a character, any character, back to your hand and playing that same character again is that it's ready and cannot be challenged that turn. So remember how earlier I talked about, Cursed Merfolk in the late game, or perhaps Kuzco in the late game, where they're trying to get that lore and they're most likely going to be removed. Well, if you don't think your opponent has removal options in their hand to target these characters, and obviously with Kuzco they can't, bibbity is a fantastic play because it can get you another couple lore, or 3 lore in Kuzco's case, out of these cards. So let's say you play a Cursed Merfolk, you quest with Cursed Merfolk, and you have the ink available. That turn you can bibbity the Cursed Merfolk, and they enter play again unexerted. And ready and ready to quest next turn if your opponent doesn't have some sort of song or action to remove them. It's even better if you can pair it with Kuzco, where Kuzco quests, you bibbity Kuzco, and there he is again, ready to quest next turn, and yeah, sitting there, and your opponent can't choose him with targeted removal, so he's ready to go. So there's something else I want to talk about with bibbity as well, and it's a ruling. If you watched some of our previous videos, you might know, but I do need to mention it. Bibbity says to return a chosen character of yours to your hand to play another character with the same cost or less for free, but you can choose not to play another character, not to do the second part of that card. And that is because when you return a card to your hand is a hidden zone. Your opponent doesn't know it's in there, and you can fail to find another target for this card. You can basically say, I've got no legal target for this card in your hand, because it's a hidden zone. So what does that do for you? Well, perhaps you need an ink. That's really the situation where it arises. Let's say you're at the end of the game, and you need one more ink to be able to do something, this turn or next turn, and you have a fox on board, let's say. You could quest for one lore with the fox, but perhaps you want to sing with the fox, you sing Bibbidi, you return the fox to your hand, and now you don't want to play a 3 cost or less character for free. Let's say you need one more ink for a Kuzco, for example. Fox is an ink, and you can now ink the fox, and you can play the Kuzco or whatever else you wanted to play. It's a situation that arises occasionally, not very often, but it's something worth mentioning because you need to know the maximum utility you can get out of this card, and that is an option that's available to you. Another card I want to talk about quickly is Ursula, Deceiver of All, for a big reason, and that is there are not terribly many songs in this deck. In this particular tempo or bounce build, I'm really running 4 Friends from the Other Side, 2 Bibbidi Bobbidi Boos, and 2 Mother Knows Best, so for a total of 8 songs. She's very good early game if you can set up the turn 3 friends. That's really what you want her for. But at other points in the game, she's not great unless you're sitting on a song in your hand and you can play her, set her up. She survives a whole turn. And then you can use a song on the next turn. It happens, but not often. The reason I want to talk about this is because she's a legendary, she's a great card, she's a valuable card, and I think the temptation with her oftentimes is if I draw her, I want to play her, or I want to keep her in an opening hand because she's just good. She's a legendary. Why wouldn't I keep her? But in general, there's a good half of the time, or maybe more, where she's just not a great card. She has 1 lore, she's expensive for a 1 lore card that doesn't do anything for you unless you have the song, and so she's often an ink target unless you're sitting on the combo piece. If you can set up the friends on turn 4, drawing 4 cards is it'll win you games, and you should always, aim for that unless you're playing an Emerald deck that'll pick this song. But in general, I only run 3 because I want to see maybe 1 copy of her a game, preferably early. And other than that, she's a card that I'm perfectly comfortable inking. Yeah. Now, there are discard versions of this deck that run Sudden Chills and other songs, which she's fantastic with. So if you're running the discard package and you can sing Sudden Chills with her, perhaps it's a card that has a little more utility in that game, and you want to play her a little more frequently. But without the Sudden Chills, and the discard package, this is a card that is great. It's great when you have the setup, but in general, it's one that I'm perfectly comfortable inking at various points in the game. So let's talk matchups. I'm generally pretty happy to play this deck into most control decks. I think Ruby Amethyst is a deck that I'm comfortable playing. Ruby Sapphire, I'm comfortable playing. Sapphire Steel is a little bit more of a challenge. Anything with Steel is a little more rough. The removal is not fun, especially when a deck is running Grab Your Swords. I actually beat it in the finals of my 54-person set championship, but it is a challenge to play, although, again, I feel comfortable going into it. Steel Song, I feel like, is a 50-50. If it goes off right away and draws into all of its removal, it can be a bad day. It's beatable, but it's probably about a 50-50 matchup. By far, this deck's worst matchup is Emerald Steel. I don't like it. I don't like playing it. It's a bad matchup. It's quick, it's aggressive, but it also has removal, and I don't like it. So I do want to talk a bit more about why Steel is a bad matchup for this deck. And a lot of people think it's just because of the removal, and that is a huge part of it. The removal is painful, Grab Your Swords is painful, and you have to play around it. But the other thing that makes this deck really challenging are some of the mid-game big bodies like Robin Hood, Champion of Sherwood, but even more importantly, Beast, Tragic Hero. This deck, these color combos just have no answer, really, for Beast, Tragic Hero. You can bounce them back to your opponent's hand with Mother Knows Best and buy yourself a turn, but eventually that Beast is going to stick and start drawing your opponent 2 cards a turn, and in Steel, they're just going to draw into more removal, and it's going to be really painful. You can run Talkative Puppets, Pinocchio, the 2-drop that exerts your opponent's characters to make them vulnerable. That is an option, but even then, to remove that Beast, you're going to need to have a fox and then a crab or something to buff your characters, because with 5 willpower, it's difficult to remove. So the best thing you can really do is exert it, run something into it, give it a little damage so it doesn't get that card draw. But again, I really think that that's one of the things that makes Emerald Steel and most Steel decks kind of hard, is having to remove that character that gives your opponent some sort of benefit, like Beast, Tragic Hero, drawing them an extra card every turn. It's not good. So the last matchup I want to talk about is the mirror match for a very specific reason. In an Emerald Amethyst mirror match, if you're running the discard package of this deck with Prince John and Sudden Chills and a couple other discardy cards, I think that's the strongest version of this deck in the mirror. I don't think it's the strongest version of this deck in the meta in general, but I do think it's the best Amethyst Emerald deck in the mirror match, which is kind of interesting. So ultimately that's it. That's Emerald Amethyst, and that's the build that I used to win a set championship with 54 people. But I will say, you know, this is a great color combo. There's a bunch of different ways you can run it. Figure out what works for you. Whether you like the discard package, whether you like Mother Knows Best and Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo, whether you want to play the bosses on a roll, and what you want your top end to be. You could run Cuscos, you could run Genies, you can run Yzmas. I've even seen people sneak some Ursulas in there, some big Ursulas, although I don't necessarily think that's the best top end. It's an option. So there's a ton of different ways to play this deck. Figure out what works for you, what works for your local meta, and yeah, just have fun with it because it's a great deck, and I think it's going to be good for a while, even going into the next set. So thanks for watching, and let me know below what you think of this color combo and maybe what deck you want to see next. Thanks.